All right, welcome back. Today, we're diving into something a little different. We're going to treat this like a case file, putting two sacred texts against each other in a kind of theological courtroom. So let's open the file and dig in.
So here's the question that kicks this whole thing off, and it's a big one. Could just one sentence uttered by one of history's most influential figures actually put him in violation of the very law he said he upheld? Now, just so we're all on the same page, we're not the judges or the jury here. Think of us more like forensic analysts. We are simply unpacking how one particular source treats these ancient texts like legal documents to build its case.
Okay, so every good investigation starts with the evidence, right? Let's lay out the key exhibits that are at the very center of this whole analysis. And this is our Exhibit A, the quote from the Gospel of John that pretty much sparks the entire investigation. Jesus gives his followers what he himself calls a new commandment. And listen, the key part isn't just to love one another. It's the brand new standard he sets. Just as I loved you. You know, that word commandment is a really big deal here. The original Greek is entele. And according to the source we're looking at, this isn't just some friendly suggestion or good advice. No, this is meant to be a binding legal instruction coming from someone who is claiming divine authority. Okay, now for Exhibit B. This is the original command, straight from the Torah. It also talks about loving your neighbor, but you really got to pay attention to the standard it sets. It's not based on some other person. It's based on you, as yourself. So when you put these two side by side, bam, there it is. That's the core of the argument. The Torah standard is internal. Love other people the way you love yourself. The new commandment standard is totally external. Love other people the way I loved you. For the source, this one little change is what the entire case is built on. All right, so we've got our evidence on the table. Now, what's the law? What's the legal code that our source is using to judge this evidence? Well, it's the Torah itself. So, what does the law say about changing the law? And here it is. This verse from Deuteronomy is absolutely central to the whole case. It's an explicit, crystal clear prohibition. You shall not add to and you shall not take away from the commandments that already exist. This is pretty much the legal bedrock for the first major charge in this analysis. So you take the evidence, that new commandment, and you measure it against that law we just saw. And what do you get? Well, according to our source material, you get a formal indictment with two very distinct charges. Okay, charge number 1, adding to God's law. Now, according to the source, this isn't as simple as just saying something new. 3 things have to happen. First, the content has to be totally new. Second, it has to be presented as an innovation, which Jesus does by literally calling it new. And third, you have to claim you're issuing it with God's authority. Now, before we get to the second charge, we got to define a term that our source uses. It's a little unusual. Instead of the word prophet, the author goes with vessel conduit. And this choice is deliberate. It really hammers home the idea of someone who claims to be a direct, unfiltered channel for a message from God. And that brings us right to the second charge, being a vessel of falsehood. Taking its cues from Deuteronomy 13, the source says the law lays out 3 steps for this offense. 1, a person claims to speak for God. 2, they perform a successful miracle or sign. And 3, they then use that credibility to get people to follow an innovation in the law. Okay, so the prosecution, in this case our source, has laid out its charges. Now it's time for the cross-examination. Let's look at some of the common defenses for these ideas and see how the source material tries to dismantle each one. All right, first counterargument you hear a lot is this one, that Jesus wasn't actually replacing the old law. He was just clarifying it or giving it a deeper meaning. But the source's rebuttal is pretty sharp. It zooms right in on the specific Greek word Jesus uses for new, kaine. The argument is that this word doesn't mean renewed or refreshed. It means something brand new, novel, unprecedented. Basically, the argument is, hey, don't take our word for it. Jesus himself called it an innovation. Okay, what about the miracles? This is a huge one, right? The logic is, if he's performing all these miracles, doesn't that prove he's got the green light from God to introduce new stuff? But here's where the source pulls out Deuteronomy 13 again. It argues that the text basically says, hold on a second, even if the miracle's real, even if the sign comes true, if that person then tells you to do something that contradicts the established law, you have to reject them. In this framework, the message, not the miracle, is the ultimate test.
All right, what about this one? This counterargument pushes back on that whole vessel of falsehood charge. It says, look, Jesus' ministry was always pointed toward the God of the Hebrew Bible, not some other different God. The rebuttal here gets into some deep theological territory. The source argues that the God described in the Hebrew Bible is formless, immortal, and definitely not human. Jesus, on the other hand, was a physical man who died. So, by telling people they needed to believe in him, specifically for their salvation, the analysis concludes that he was, in effect, setting himself up as a separate ruling power, which is the final piece of that puzzle from Deuteronomy.
So, we've seen the evidence, we've heard the applicable law, and we've gone through the cross-examination. Now we come to the source's final verdict. And so here it is, the conclusion. Just by following its own method of treating these texts like a legal file, the source concludes that the new commandment is guilty on 2 counts. First, adding to God's law, and second, being a vessel of falsehood.
And with that, the case file is closed. But you know, whether you agree with this verdict or not, it leaves us with a really fascinating question to chew on. What happens when we analyze sacred text as if it were a legal document? How much does the lens you use to read something ultimately change what you see? That's something to think about.